My next guest was born in Toronto, a graduate of University of Toronto and Ryerson University. He was a newspaper reporter for 13 years, including 3 years as the Parliament Hill correspondent for the London Free Press. He has co-written 10 trivia, history, music books about Canada. As a longtime freelance writer, his work has been published in newspapers and magazines across Canada and the United States, including a regular trivia column. He's interviewed some of Canada's music greats. So let's spill the tea with Randy Ray. Randy, welcome.
Morning, David. How goes it?
Well, it's going fantastic. And Randy, I get the feeling that I've hit the treasure trove here with you because you've interviewed already so many great musicians, and I get to tap into that experience that you have, and you get to share the experience that you had with interviewing some of those greats, which we're going to get to. We're going to talk about a few people that you interviewed for your book. But when did you make the transition from political writer to trivia expert, or is that something that's always been in your blood?
A very interesting question. I got sent to Parliament Hill by the London Free Press in 1986. And at the time, Mark Carney, the fellow that I co-authored all the books with, he and I at the time were just getting going on an idea that we'd launched actually on the beach at my cottage near Peterborough. It was going to be a column that basically I dug up, maybe not the right word, but found musicians who had been, stars and fairly popular in their heyday, and had faded from the media and landscape and in the public eye. And basically, Mark had seen a column in the Rolling Stone that was doing the same thing. They found the young rascals and the grassroots and all that, and told you what they did and where they are today. And so we launched a Canadian column in 1976. So just as I got sent to Parliament Hill, our first column launched. And it was about Motherlode, a London band from London, Ontario. And we went, oh my God, Brandy, we're starting this column. And what are you going to do? You're going to Parliament Hill, and how are you going to have time to do it? But in retrospect, and at the time, it was a great sort of diversion. Politics is tough to cover. It's thick. It taxes your brain. I'm writing about the free trade agreement and the Meech Lake Accord and all this stuff. And so to write about music and interview these guys on the side in my spare time was a nice sort of valve that let off some steam and that let me have some fun. Not that politics wasn't fun, but it was a different kind of fun.
So the trivia bug bit you when?
Well, Mark has always been a TV nut. You ask him anything, who played Leave It to Beaver, who was, the star on, the FBI. He and I was always just, we were both very curious because we were reporters, right? And then Trivial Pursuit was pretty hot around that time too.
Oh, right, yeah.
So this was the columns we wrote, both music and trivia, were sort of two-pronged because they were a labor of love. We both loved trivia and music, but it also put some money in the bank. And we it was great to dig up stuff and tell people about it. And one of the biggest compliments we ever received from anybody, music-wise or trivia-wise, was they'd read something we wrote and they'd go, I didn't know that. And we go, oh yeah, baby, we've hit the mark here. On the music side, which was really the labor of love, because as I told you when we first met, I got the Canadian music bit by the Canadian music when I was in high school in Scarborough. Went to Wexford Collegiate in when did I start there? 1966. And all the good bands and Canadian bands in Toronto would come to our school, the Ugly Ducklings, Lighthouse, the Poppers, Stitch in Time. So, basically we told some great stories about them, wheels falling off their trucks when they were out on tour, fights in the bands, where names came from for songs, how they split up and fought, just some great stories. And I think both the trivia and the music, I think our goal was always to introduce you to stuff. You can't say a lot in a story, but introduce you to something fantastic about Toronto, be it trivia or music, or about Canada, be it trivia or music, and then you could go onward and upward and find the full story somewhere else.
We're in conversation with Randy Ray, a trivia expert and on music in Canada. Uh, you're a co-author, Mark Kearney, and you wrote a book called As the Years Go By. Um, Tell us about the five-man electrical band. You mentioned they started as the Staccatos. They're an Ontario band. Everybody knows them. I think one of the trivia things would be people would be surprised to find out that they're a Canadian band because of that hit that they had that just swept North America. The song called "Signs." Uh, what else can you tell us about Les Emerson? You knew him personally. What was it like when you met him, and how did he get involved in music?
Well, they started out as a band called the Staccatos, and they had a couple of minor hits. One of their bigger ones was a song called "Half Past Midnight,"
Mm-hmm.
and it's a great song. They had two drummers for most of their career, and part of it is that the song it stops in the middle, and that never happened in the oldies. You didn't stop a song in the middle. Les was part of that band, and there was another guy, Dean Hagopian, who was a radio jock here in Ottawa, was one of the main men. He eventually left, and then the band morphed into. They wanted a new name, so they turned the name into the Five Man Electrical Band, and they had a lot of hits. The Werewolf song, half past midnight was earlier. They had about 7 or 8 hits, 5 or 6 albums, and there were two brothers in the band with him, and a bass player named Brian Rating, and um, they just what would you call their music? Kind of almost well, popular pop rock, but with a bit of a country flavor to it.
Mm-hmm.
And they did very well. And then after they split up, Les hung out in the States for a while and did did a solo career. And he had a song called "Control of Me" and a couple of other ones that did fairly well.
Let's move on to Denny Doherty. I was surprised to find that Denny Doherty was a Canadian from the Mamas and the Papas. How did you connect with Denny, and what did you find out about him?
Well, that question you ask about how we connected with people, that's a very good question. That's a very good question because the whole key to writing a column that we wrote, which morphed into the book, was how in God's name do you find these people? And so if I sat down with Les Emerson, or if I sat down with Rick Patterson, the drummer for the Esquires, or anybody, guaranteed an hour after we did when I walked out the door after the interview, after we'd had a beer or lunch or something, those guys would have given me 5 names of the next guys we wanted to find with a phone number. Remember, no emails back then. So I'd say to Les, do you know anybody in the Cooper brothers, or do you know anybody in Don Norman and the other 4, or Lighthouse or the Ugly Ducklings? And sure as shooting, yeah, I'll call you in 10 minutes, or here's where to find them, or I know his brother. Denny, I don't really recall how we found him, but I think it might have been through an agent. And at the time I talked to him, the Mamas and the Papas original band was kaput. They were long gone. And Denny was living in Mississauga with his wife and 1 or 2 kids, and he was acting. And that's where I phoned him. So I phoned him, talked to him. I think I interviewed Denny 4 times. What came out of that interview was the name dropping. I mean, he met everybody over various substances, whether it be beer, coffee, or whatever. He'd had chatted with John Lennon and Jim Morrison, and
Right.
the stories he would tell. But just a great guy to talk to, talented, creative, broad in his thinking. He not only sang and performed. The Mamas and Papas were on the Ed Sullivan Show once or twice, but was a great actor. He was in a play in Toronto called Fire, and about a preacher, a Southern preacher who basically breathed fire. And just the stories he told me, people he met were great, just fantastic.
Well, he would have been part of that Laurel Canyon scene out in California
Precisely.
as well. And I just did an interview with Patty Janetta, who was an 80s, 90s pop star. She was 17 when she went out there, went to a party in Laurel Canyon, and talks about going to the door as a 17-year-old with a couple of people from the cast of Jesus Christ Superstar that she was part of. And she said she looked in and everybody was, jumping in the pool naked. So, I mean, the stories that came out of Laurel Canyon, which I'm
Yeah,
sure Denny had a number
yeah.
of them as well, were quite something.
Well, one of the things I asked him was, I said, you must have some amazing memorabilia from your mama's and papa's days, like a guitar or a microphone stand or this or sheet music. He goes, nope, Randy, all I got left is a fur coat that Cass Elliot gave me. Everything else just disappeared.
Let's talk about another person that you interviewed, Cheryl Ray of the Rays. So that was a little bit of a different story. They had a television show that
Yeah, yeah.
they did. So how did you connect with Cheryl?
Well, we again, the time when we talked to her, she was in Bolton, Ontario. You know where Bolton is?
I know very well where Bolton
Yeah,
is. Yes.
northwest of Toronto, north of Toronto. Cheryl is from London, Ontario, and she met Robbie Ray, who would become her husband in England. And they got married, joined forces, and they became a disco act of all things. And disco, oh, you remember the disco years? Disco was pretty big. So Cheryl and Robbie Ray, and their first big hit was a song called "Que Sera Sera." But anyway, they met. They did it. They did fine. They were kind of, I wouldn't call them a flash in the pan. They did all right with some hits. They did the TV show.
Mhm.
And then they broke up, and they both kind of went solo. And then Robbie Ray actually uh, was injured in the big tsunami that hit, was it Thailand or one of those places? You remember that on Boxing Day several years ago?
Yes.
That big storm. He got injured and then he died not too long after that.
Wow.
And Cheryl, I saw her a couple of summers ago. She was back in London, Ontario, performing at a small music venue. And I actually spoke with her online yesterday. She's now living in Florida, and she was in real estate. She still sings disco, and she was doing one of those people who goes on a ship and is the in-house performer.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes.
Still performing. She has a twin sister. I asked her to tell me a little bit about songwriting, and she said, because I know you're interested in that, and she said she didn't write a lot of the early stuff, but she started writing it later. And one of the things that kind of miffed her was that she would sit down with a band or a couple of guys around the piano or the guitar or whatever. They'd work together and write. She would do the bulk of the work, and then a record would come out, and the other guys would take all the credit. She would get zero credit. So she was a little ticked about that.
I'm sure that happens more than we even know about.
Yeah.
How many interviews are in the book, Randy?
Well, the book has stories of about 150 different people. So they're everything from bands to soloists to managers to like Jack Richardson, the Guess Who's producer. I interviewed him at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. He was teaching music production. But anyway, basically, it's mainly stories about performers. So everything from Lighthouse to the Ugly Ducklings. We try to cover the West, Quebec. The book's broken down into sections. So, for example, we have here early pioneers like Chad Allen of Chad Allen and the Expressions, the early Guess Who.
Right.
The Beaumarks, Norma Matteo, who was on a CBC TV show, TV show, I should say. I believe it was At the Hop. Is that what it was called? The Crew Cuts, Gene Cornish of the Rascals. Then we do R&B and soul, Montreal music, the Toronto scene, music west, folk country, and bands, we call it more pop than rock, and then more rock than pop. And then people behind the scenes. So Sandy Gardner, a one-time newspaper reporter in Ottawa, who widely, although disputed, gets credit for coining the term Beatlemania. If you look at a Beatles album, you've got the Beatlemania album. There's a
Right.
quote from his newspaper column on the cover. Walter Grealish, Jack Richardson, Mel Shaw, Paul White, they're all industry giants in their day
Wow.
behind the scenes.
Now, if people want to get a copy of the book, Randy, how do they do that?
Well, you know what? The easiest way to do it is to go on Amazon. Just go on Amazon.ca and type in "As the Years Go By," and several of them will come up. We're not the first book to be called "As the Years Go By." So the name "As the Years Go By," we pulled that. That was Mark came up with that idea for the name, And, Mash McCann of Montreal
Yes,
had that
yeah,
as a record, right? A huge hit. So we
yeah.
actually called up the band and asked them, just out of courtesy, do you mind? You had the song. We're going to call the book this. And they go, yeah, go for it. We don't mind.
It's amazing how some bands are so protective of their material, like the Eagles. The Eagles are extremely protective about it, and other bands, it's almost a compliment to them to say, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, use it. We're happy to do that."
Yeah.
We're in conversation with Randy Ray. Randy, you and I met through your Facebook group. Tell us about that.
Well, the Facebook group is called Canadian Music Lovers, and I started it about 2 to 3 years ago, just to give as a forum for people to give input, talk about Canadian music, tell your stories, show us your pictures, and we now have 2,200 followers, which isn't huge, but there are some pretty members of Claw too, and several other bands. I think a couple of guys. I keep bringing up the Ugly Ducklings. I used to stand at Dan's Smoke Shop in Victoria Park in Surrey and Scarborough with Dave Bingham, the lead singer of the Ugly Ducklings. And we'd sit there. He'd be smoking an Export A, and I'd be licking a popsicle. And so, but anyway, it's a forum. I encourage people to join and to tell stories, and we get some good ones. But we encourage people to if you've got books. A lot of sites say you can't be commercial. I say if you've written a book, and a buddy of mine, Jamie Vernon's writing a book right now about Keith Hampshire.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah.
So I encourage you to tell me about your book, because we want people to know about books, because I promote my book on there, so you promote yours too. So Canadian
Yeah.
Music Lovers found on Facebook.
Keith Hampshire has an interesting story. He started off as a disc jockey and then had that big hit, First Cut is the Deepest, which has been covered over and over again.
Oh yeah.
So
I think
that's
that was actually, that might have been written by Cat Stevens.
We've been in conversation with Randy Ray. Randy is a music trivia expert. And if you are interested, check out his book, As the Years Go By. Randy, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, and good luck with your show, David.